Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. This is Unit 4, Lecture 2 on Rationalism and Skepticism. So for today's reading, we're looking at Cartesian Doubt and the Search for Foundational Knowledge, obviously not the original title, by René Descartes. So in today's lecture, we're going to do the usual sort of stuff, overview of the big positions, go through things in detail, and look at potential issues. So, in this unit, if you'll recall, we're looking into issues of epistemology, that is the study of knowledge. In particular, we're looking into issues of what is knowledge of the world and how do we get it? What are valid sources of knowledge and sort of what is it? And in the process of looking at that question, we named three positions we're going to be studying in this unit: rationalism, empiricism, and skepticism. And if you recall, rationalism is the view that at least some of our knowledge about the world is gained a priori, in other words, through reason alone. You don't actually have to go out and experience anything with one of your five senses, or other senses, to learn something about the world. Empiricism is the view that all of our knowledge comes from, or all of our knowledge of the world comes a posteriori, that is, through sense experience. Empiricists do usually think that a priori knowledge is a thing, but they don't think that it's knowledge of the world. They don't think it's actually telling us anything new or novel or interesting about the world around us. And skepticism is the view that we either do not or cannot have knowledge of the world. So today's reading is going to focus both on the first and the last positions, on rationalism and skepticism. And it actually gives us the basic points and arguments for the classic versions of each of those two positions. So we're kind of hitting two birds with one stone here. It's kind of nice that way. And in order to do all this, we're actually going to be looking back at an author we've already read. If you recall last unit, we looked at a piece by René Descartes on substance dualism, the idea that we're composed of both physical and non-physical parts, and these things are distinct substances. So we read Descartes, a French modern philosopher, writing in the 1600s. And, remember, modern's a relative term here. We read Descartes to see sort of the classic version of that view. Well, in the process of getting to that view, he actually does a lot of other things as well. Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, like the big work that he's really known for, covers a lot of areas in philosophy. And so while we've looked at some of his stuff on metaphysics, his things on the philosophy of mind and what sort of creatures are we and what sort of things exist out in the world, well, in order to get to that, he actually has to work on some epistemological issues. Because recall that Descartes' big goal, more than anything else, was to find an absolute solid foundation from which he could derive all of his other beliefs. So that way, everything he believed would be absolutely clear and correct and justified. He wouldn't have any beliefs hanging around that he didn't have good reason to think were true. And in essence, that's really doing epistemology. It has to do with finding a foundation for belief and then deriving all of your other beliefs from that foundation. In other words, finding a certain element of knowledge and then deriving other pieces of knowledge from it. Because it's not just any beliefs we're caring about, it's justified true beliefs and that sort of thing. What we usually call knowledge. This process really isn't that far off from doing a really good bit of math or taking accurate measurements. Suppose, for example, and if you're still unclear as to what Descartes' doing, suppose, for example, that you were to find with absolute certainty how long your arm was, like say from your elbow to your fingertips. Then, forevermore, you would be able to say, well, my fingers cover so much of a length of an arm, or, say this random object I want to measure covers so much of an arm, and you could use your arm then to accurately measure everything else. Because every measurement you did using your arm would be based on an absolutely certain measurement that you started with, that is the length of your arm. And that's basically how we got the crazy English imperial units that are still used in the United States, things like feet and miles and cups and gallons and the rest. People started with one consistent, accurate measurement that they knew, and they derived everything else from it. We do a much more consistent job of that with the metric system these days. So, this is the kind of thing that Descartes' doing. Descartes' trying to find something, which is one belief, one thing that he knows with absolute certainty. And if he can get that absolute certain foundational belief, then he can use that to build up and prove every other belief that he might have. That way he'll only end up believing true and justified things. And so to accomplish this, Descartes proceeds in three main steps throughout the entirety of the Meditations. First, he tries to doubt absolutely everything. And he says, if I can doubt it, if there's any shadow of a doubt that it's true at all, if it's possible for it to be false, I'm going to throw it away. Because I'm only looking for things that are absolutely certain. In order to find what beliefs are absolutely certain, I'm going to try and doubt everything. If I can doubt it, it gets thrown away. Once he's finished doubting everything, he should be, or he thinks he's been left with, some sort of an absolutely certain foundation, a belief that cannot consistently or rationally be doubted. And once he's got that foundation, in the third step, he's then going to use that foundation to build his knowledge back up. Because it's not enough to know one thing, you actually have to know stuff about the world if you're going to do things like step out of the way of oncoming buses and feed yourself and function like a real human adult. So, those are the three big steps that Descartes does in his entire project, big picture stuff. Our reading is going to show us selections, a quick version of the first two steps. Our other reading on substance dualism, the thing about the philosophy of mind and what sort of things are we, is actually coming from parts of the third step in Descartes' work, where Descartes is figuring out what sort of things exist, what sort of things are real, based on the things he'll prove in this reading. Now, you might have guessed, just based on either doing the reading or just guessing because things kind of line up this way, that in each of these different steps, Descartes is actually going to give us the basis for each of the positions that we're considering. So like the first step, doubt absolutely everything, actually gives us the strongest arguments just to support skepticism. If Descartes just wrote a book about the first step, or not about the first step, but doing the first step, and stopped after completing that, he would actually be classified as a skeptic, because he gives really good arguments for skepticism, and for that is thinking that we don't actually have any certain or true justified knowledge about the external world. He raises those issues, and then spends the rest of his book, the rest of the Meditations, trying to resolve those arguments, trying to show that those arguments aren't actually true, that there's, the conclusions aren't ones that we should endorse. So it's only in the second and third steps that Descartes actually shows himself to be a rationalist. So, first part of the work is the skeptical part, the later parts are the rationalist work. If you get confused while doing the reading, if you can't keep track of what it is he's trying to prove, since we're kind of attributing two different positions to him, this is the kind of roadmap that I think should help you out a little bit. So the first part of the work is showing and proving skepticism, and then the latter part of the work is trying to show that skepticism is false. He's trying to prove rationalism at the end of the day. So to see exactly how he goes about doing this, let's take a look at these steps in more detail. The usual part where we zoom in a little bit on the reading. So, Descartes begins the article, the selection that we've got, by what's called motivating his project. That is, giving the reasons as for why he's doing it and what it is he hopes to accomplish here. And basically, he gives a really common sense and relatable reason for doing all this sort of thing. He says that he's realized that many of his beliefs in the past, when he was all younger and stupid and all that, were actually held in error. That is, he made a lot of mistakes with the things he believed in the past. And the time has finally come where he is older, more mature, and has a bit of free time for him to actually sit around and try and figure out what things were mistakes of his youth and what things he should not believe anymore. So it's sort of like when you finally, hit your early 20s and you realize that when you were 16 you actually were a little bit of an idiot, and you didn't realize it at 18, but now you kind of do, and so you're going to reevaluate the things that are most important to you. Descartes is doing that. He's trying to figure out what beliefs were mistakes from earlier on in his life. And to do this, he decides that he's going to try, like as a test, he's going to try and doubt and reconsider everything he's ever believed. But that's a ridiculously huge task. It's not like you can sit down and start filling a book with, I believe the sky is blue. I believe there's a cloud to the left of the sun. I believe that I'm wearing pants today. I believe that there are 3 pairs of pants in my dresser. You can't just go and list every belief that you have. It's a monumentally, ridiculously huge task to try and do such a thing. So while that's kind of what Descartes wants to accomplish, it's not realistic to go and just try and consider each individual belief. Instead, what Descartes says is he's going to find the principles that are the sources of those beliefs. So like if he learned that he's wearing pants and then he has 3 pants in his dresser from, say, his senses, by seeing them, then he's going to go ahead and just skip all the derived beliefs and go straight to the source. He's going to doubt the source and the ideas that led to particular beliefs so that he can doubt whole batches of beliefs all at once. So if he doubts that his senses are accurate, that they're reliable and truthful, then he just all of a sudden, as a consequence, doubts all of the beliefs that are caused and given to him by his senses. So by attacking the sources and foundations of beliefs, he'll lose those beliefs as well, the ones that are attached and derived from them. So, having made his plan, Descartes actually starts doubting. Now, some beliefs go pretty easily, but what he's previously considered most true, he figured out through his senses. So he starts, going through and evaluating a few beliefs, and after he goes through a few different things, he comes to those that he previously thought were some of the most obvious and certain things. Again, we're getting selections of the work here. We're getting just pieces of the book. But in the part where we see, he's worked his way down to what he previously thought were the most certain things he could believe. And those were the things that he could see and touch and smell and hear and otherwise experience with his physical senses. Those previously seemed pretty obvious to him. You generally don't think that you're crazy and that the computer in front of you is not actually there. Generally, if you can see it, you trust your senses enough to say, well, obviously, it's right there in front of me. But since he's doing what's called radical doubt, in his own words, well, even those things that previously seemed pretty certain, he starts to wonder about. He starts doubting whether or not he can actually trust his senses. Because while they're generally reliable, like 99% of the time, they don't lie to him. 1% of the time, they have. There have been cases where you're sick, and you start hallucinating things as part of a fever. Thankfully, that doesn't happen much anymore, because people don't get that sick from fevers usually. But it does still occasionally happen. Or things like desert mirages, where you see images of water through distorted air that aren't actually there. Or say you thought you saw somebody around the corner, but it turns out to be a plastic bag or a mannequin or something like that. So it comes, Descartes starts to realize that while his senses are generally reliable, while usually he thinks they're some of the most certain things he has access to, they're actually not perfectly reliable. They have lied to him in the past. They've tricked him previously. And honestly, you're just kind of a dumb guy if you continue to, without question, trust a liar that has lied to you previously. And he starts thinking, well, even though everything seems obvious to me right now, that I'm, sitting at this desk and doing this work and looking at this table and so on, perhaps I'm actually just dreaming everything, or maybe hallucinating. Because dreams can seem incredibly real. You might have had a dream at one point where you weren't sure whether you'd woken up. Probably a few of you have had that dreaded dream where you dreamed that you got up and started getting ready for class or work or something, only to wake up and realize that you hadn't done any of it and you're now 20 minutes late. That's the sort of thing Descartes starts wondering, is that sort of thing happening to me right now? And because he thinks it's possible, that because our senses can't be perfectly trusted, we really shouldn't treat them nearly as obviously or shouldn't treat them as the obvious and reliable sources of information and knowledge that we usually do. So, he's going to throw those out. And once the senses can't be trusted, it seems like he shouldn't trust anything that he knows about the physical world. Because everything that he knows about extended substance, remember physical things that occupy space and have dimensions and all that? Well, all of that stuff you only learn about through the senses. You only know about external physical things because you can see and touch and smell and otherwise experience them. And that even includes whether or not he has a body. You only know that you have feet because you can see them and feel them and you know that they're there. If you really want to stretch it into modern terms that Descartes wouldn't understand, human beings have a sense of proprioception, that is, the knowledge of where your body parts at all times. But that's actually a physical sense. And if you can't trust your physical senses, well, then we really shouldn't trust that I've got feet or hands or that I actually have a body at all. I might just be a mind, a ghost. But even saying that he might not have a body, that's not enough for Descartes. It's not just that he might be, or that some of the doubts he has about the physical world are, worthwhile doubts. He wants to doubt absolutely everything. And so far, we've thrown out stuff about the physical world. We've whittled down our beliefs quite a lot by the time he gets to this point. But Descartes' still left with all the mental world, all of his thoughts and feelings and experiences that are entirely internal, the stuff you experience just by thinking and reflecting and, having a quiet night to yourself. So he's still left with what you might call his inner life. Well, because Descartes wants to be thorough, he's going to try and doubt all of this stuff too. So Descartes comes up with a thought experiment. There's a hypothesis. Suppose that there's an evil genius following him around, tricking him constantly. In some translations of the work or some renditions of it, it's referred to as an evil demon, because it's got magical powers. But suppose it's like an evil mad genius, mad scientist sort of character. Suppose that this genius has figured out ways to give him false sense impressions, or even to make him think in different ways. Like the evil genius has figured out some kind of machinery and device that, like, even when he's doing basic math and arithmetic, Descartes goes 2 + 2 equals, and the evil genius has figured out a way to jump in and in the middle of his results say the answer's 5. So even though Descartes knows that 2 + 2 would equal 4, the evil genius can still trick him into thinking that it's 5. Or it might trick him into thinking that he exists or that he has a mind. He's starting to wonder, how much can this evil genius actually trick me if he were to exist? Because remember, Descartes' thinking, if I can doubt it at all, if there's the smallest possibility that this is true, then I should throw out the associated beliefs because they're not certain. Well, if there's an evil genius who can do this kind of trickery, then we can throw out even everything we know about, say, our minds. If an evil genius has figured out a way to, mess with our very minds, then really nothing is safe. And you can start to see how, if you start advocating these kinds of positions, if you start saying, if there's the smallest possibility that this is wrong, it's possible I'm being tricked right now, you can see why this sort of line of thinking would lead to skepticism. Because as soon as you start saying, well, I don't know for a fact that any of this stuff is real, that any of this stuff is true, you start to wonder, maybe I don't know anything about the world at all. And therein lies the heart of skepticism, in thinking that you don't actually know anything about the world. Now, you might know a handful of facts about, like, definitions and thoughts and that sort of thing. Math, what bachelors are, what a round square is, namely being impossible. You might know a few different things, but the core of skepticism is thinking that you don't or can't have any knowledge of what the world's actually like. But by the end of it, when we actually get to the rationalist part of the work, Descartes starts realizing that this isn't really a worry. That while it's possible he's being tricked, while it's possible that they can deceive him about everything, about whether there's other people in the world, whether there are physical objects around him, he can doubt virtually all of that sort of thing. He can even doubt whether he does math correctly, whether there's an evil genius messing with his mind. But the last worry that he considers, whether or not he even exists, that one's not really a thing. That's not really a problem he has to worry about. Because suppose that there is an evil genius who's following him around, or has, tricked him into thinking that all these other things are true. The last thing that Descartes considers could he be tricked about is whether or not he exists. And if you start to think about that, Descartes realizes he can't be tricked about whether or not he exists. Because no matter what the evil genius is doing to trick him, well, there's still a him that's being tricked. Or more realistically, if Descartes is doubting everything, if he's doubting whether or not there is a world, whether or not there are external objects, whether or not he's got a body, whether or not he's thinking accurately and correctly, the one thing he cannot sanely and rationally doubt is that there's currently some thinking going on. He's doubting all of his beliefs. And no matter what else he thinks about his life, he knows that right now, in this moment, he is doubting things. That seems more obvious than anything else. If he's not doubting things, then this whole thing is just insane. You literally can't make it make sense. Therefore, because he cannot sanely and rationally doubt that he is doubting, he knows that he actually has to exist. Because he knows at least one thing, that he's doubting, and that he's thinking about his beliefs right now. So, Descartes comes up with a really famous line out of philosophy. I think, therefore I am. In Latin, you sometimes see it put out in the original Latin, cogito ergo sum. Literally just means I think, therefore I am. So you've heard this phrase probably a few times before, seen it on a poster or a book, or by somebody who's trying to act way too smart at a party. What the phrase actually means is that in the context of trying to find out what in life is absolutely certain, no matter how much Descartes doubts, no matter how much he might think that he's being tricked, he knows for certain that he's currently thinking right now. Because if he's not thinking, then what's going on? That sort of thing just doesn't make sense. Thoughts are happening while he's doubting, which means, just by necessity, that there's a thinker having all of those thoughts. Therefore, Descartes knows for certain that he exists. The one thing he cannot doubt is that he is doubting right now. Therefore, this is a fact about the world that Descartes knows that cannot be doubted. It's the only fact he knows that is absolutely certain, and he knows that fact through reason alone. Therefore, this is a piece of a priori knowledge, and it's a foundation he can use to build all of his beliefs back up. This is the foundational belief that cannot be rationally doubted. It's the one thing he knows for certain. And if he knows it for certain, it becomes the accurate foundation he can use to derive all of his other beliefs. And then he spends, at this point in the meditation, he spends all of the rest of the book building his beliefs back up. Now, he does it probably a little more quickly than he should have, and there's a lot of doubts as to how good those arguments actually are, in addition to a few other problems. Because generally the argument goes something like, well, he knows that he exists. He knows that he had to have a source, a creator, because he didn't exist forever. Therefore, there had to be something like God. Well, God, by nature, is good and wouldn't trick him. Therefore, his senses are trustworthy. Therefore, the external world exists just like he believes it does. If that sounds a little sketchy to you, you're not alone. But supposedly, Descartes uses this foundational belief of I think, therefore I am, to build everything back up. But all that stuff is kind of, above your pay grade. You don't have to worry about any of that kind of thing. What you need to worry about and keep track of is the fact that Descartes has considered the possibility of skepticism. He's considered the possibility that nothing he knows is actually true, and that he would have no way of actually proving that any of this stuff is real. And because he can't prove it, he's got good reason to doubt that he knows anything at all. He just believes a few things, and he might luckily have some of those beliefs line up. But the one thing he does know for certain, he knows through reason alone. And because it's possible to know at least something about the world through reason alone, rationalism is true. As far as our big question goes of what is knowledge and how can we get it, we know that at least some of our beliefs, at least this one foundational thing, according to Descartes, can be known through reason alone. So reason can give us knowledge, and it can be the foundation for all of our other knowledge, including our sense experiences and that sort of thing. Now, Descartes' arguments are not universally accepted. We don't start all future philosophy works after Descartes by saying, I know I exist, therefore yada yada is true. We don't do that sort of thing. Descartes is not the be-all, end-all of philosophy. A lot of people, even very quickly after Descartes, started embracing views of empiricists and even some other rationalists in the same time period as Descartes, didn't think that Descartes actually really proved that he existed. For example, a very common critique is that while Descartes may have proved that thoughts exist, he didn't necessarily prove that they're located in him or any thinker at all. Perhaps they're just random thoughts floating around in a void or something like that. He didn't prove things nearly as conclusively as he thought he did, according to these other people that object. You might disagree. A few other people doubt whether any of this knowledge is actually a priori. We'll see some folks in a future lesson, John Locke and David Hume, who really doubt that you can have much knowledge at all a priori. They think that everything, even the ideas and concepts in your head, things like thought and self and identity, all of these things are still based on experience, according to some of them. So a few people disagree that, even if they say that Descartes proved something, maybe he didn't prove it a priori, since all these concepts rely on experience in some way. And then there are the people that endorse skepticism. These folks often argue that Descartes never actually removed the doubts about whether or not all these different things are true. He raises the possibility that maybe he doesn't know anything about the world at all, and he never actually addresses the possibility very well. He just starts going off in a different direction and left those questions unanswered, or at least so the skeptics argue. As to which one of these is true, or if any of these critiques are true, I leave that up to you. These are the sorts of things that you should consider as you evaluate and reflect on the reading, and as you do your journal for the unit. So the critiques aren't necessarily correct, but they do show that while Descartes seemingly, did this big conclusive proof about what knowledge is, and that we know that we exist for certain, it's not actually all that certain or conclusive. There's still a lot of debate up in the air. But it is nice. It's not too complicated and a little straightforward. So, overall, it's not a bad bit of work. It's something that's definitely worth considering and evaluating. Now, it is still rather dense, and he moved very quickly, especially in our selection from the readings. So if you're still kind of confused on this, make sure to go back, take notes on the reading, listen back to the lecture again, and as always, feel free to shoot me any questions or confusions that you have, and I'll do my best to help clear them up. That said, that's Descartes in a nutshell. Although you probably couldn't fit Descartes in a nutshell. But either way, there's the Rationalism and Skepticism readings for this unit. So, good luck. Continue to do your readings and your journals and whatnot, and happy thinking.